Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, first of all, to Professor Mariam Lowe, Catherine Danks, my mentor, Judy Propose, and everyone at the School of Cities, including my fellow fellowship peers, for all the incredible sharing of insights and experiences that you've all done, as well as for the incredible guidance that you've provided for me into what I hope would be the successful culmination of this project that myself and two other colleagues have been working on in the past few months. So my name is Andi Darell Alhakim. I'm a current fourth year student at the University of Toronto, specializing in political science with a double minor in ethics, law, society, and diaspora transnational studies. And the project, the presentation that I have the honor of delivering here today is titled The Disappearing Face of Compassion, Legacy of Jakarta's Forced Evictions of Urban Riverbank Slums. And what I would hope to be able to do today is through these 6 maps that you currently see on the screen, as well as quite a few others down the line in the presentation deck, we would be able to tell a somewhat compelling story of what is currently going on in Jakarta, the current situation, current status quo, and sort of what outlook we have for the future, and what sorts of recommendations and pathways for improvements that we could probably propose. And so let's move on to this next slide, which gives us a very sort of brief context of Jakarta. So as you can see, it's this sprawling urban metropolitan hub in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, which I also call my home. It is the current capital, both administrative as well as things relating to financial activities of Indonesia. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of development, a lot of construction going on in Jakarta. But what has also been sort of a frequent annual occasion as well, perhaps, is flooding. So there's a great number of flooding due to perhaps a great number of rivers that flow through Jakarta as well. And what has sort of resulted out of that is that there's a lot of forced evictions. And so the forced evictions that have been going on have at numerous times, and rather quite frequently as well, as propagated through the media, saying that the justification for these forced evictions is for the mitigation of flooding. And so throughout this presentation today, we're going to sort of delve deeper and see whether or not that actually is a sound justification, sound rationale for the forced evictions that has been going on. Okay, so first of all, we're going to actually start with this map, which we're going to go into the story of Bu Nur Aini. So Bu Nur Aini is a resident of Pasar Ikan Penjaringan, the neighborhood you currently see highlighted in red there in the map. And we found her story when looking through a Kompas, which is a quite reputable press association in Indonesia. And essentially, her family were evicted, forcibly evicted from their home in Pasar Ikan Penjaringan, northern Jakarta, out of the justification that they lived on the riverbank, and sort of not only as an eviction would be good for the family, or so has been argued, sort of good because it sort of moves them out of a place that is very high risk for flooding, but also because their occupation of that particular region, the riverbank of the area, increases the risk for flooding for the entire area. And so there's a multi-layer justification for their eviction, and we're going to see whether or not that actually holds. So let's actually see whether or not Bu Nur Aini's neighborhood actually lies near waterways, right? So in this next map, we're going to see all of the waterways in Jakarta, which, as we can see, is quite a lot, right? It's definitely quite a lot, and it is perhaps more useful for us to be able to see not only all of the riverways in Jakarta, as we currently see through this map, but a more sort of scaled version, right? Ones that depict the difference between a large river and sort of a small canal, right? And so in this next slide, we're going to see that differentiation when it comes to the scaling of the actual size of the waterways. So as we can see, so far, it does seem as though Bu Nur Aini's neighborhood in Pasar Ikan Penjaringan really does sit on quite a major waterway there, because as we can see, there's a sort of blue line that is somewhat bolded, right? And not only that, it sits very close to the bay up north. And so the justification, the argument perhaps that this is for the mitigation of flooding, perhaps currently holds. Okay, so let's think about it this way then, right? So Bu Nur Aini's family were moved out of their neighborhood, but the government has to provide a solution for this, right? They have to give a temporary housing, affordable housing, after Bu Nur Aini were and her family were relocated. So let's actually look at what an acceptable distance for relocation would be. And as we can see here in the depiction, this depicts travel distances by 5, 10, and 15 kilometers out from Bu Nur Aini's neighborhood. So as we can see there, the sort of whitish purple, the first layer around Bu Nur Aini's highlighted red neighborhood right there is 5 kilometers out. And then the second layer of purple is 10 kilometers out. And then the third layer, at the very outer layer there, is 15 kilometers out. And as we can probably know, 15 kilometers is pretty far away already, right? For those of us who live in the greater Toronto area, we may know that Mississauga to Toronto is upwards of 20 kilometers. And so 15 kilometers is pretty far away already. But let's actually look at where Bu Nur Aini and her family were located to in this next slide, in the next map over here. So that's where they are. We can see it at the second neighborhood highlighted in red right there. So by our calculations, that is around 25 kilometers out, which takes upwards of 2.5 hours when you take public transit, which is the case that Bu Nur Aini is going to do, right? Because unfortunately, they live on the riverbank. They don't possess personal vehicles. They don't have cars. And so any travel between Pasar Ikan Penjaringan and their new temporary housing in the area of Rusunawa Cakung is going to have to be by public transit. And what we know now is that Bu Nur Aini actually makes that trip often. Why? Because it apparently what is moved is only their house. The rest of their lives is still in Pasar Ikan Penjaringan. Her husband still works at Pasar Ikan Penjaringan. Their kids still go to school in Pasar Ikan Penjaringan in northern Jakarta. And so these solutions, not only can we see, are not comprehensive enough, they don't really tackle sort of issues that are integral to someone's lives, right? Sort of their livelihoods, their education. It's simply the moving of one's house. And so we really got to delve deeper and see what sorts of solutions we can then propose, right? Okay, so here we can see the elections happening in Indonesia. This is going to be a very crucial consideration for us because the case study that we're going to take for the eviction points in the next map is going to be eviction points from 2017, which is a crucial year because it's an election year for the governorship in Jakarta. But not only that, during 2017, Jakarta actually had 3 governors. And the reason why is because, there's first of all, the incumbent, the previous governor, and then the interim governor during the election cycle, and then the newly elected governor afterwards. And so the eviction points that we're going to see all throughout 2017 is not only perhaps like a confounding variable of just one governor who apparently wants to evict that many people, right? It's part of a bigger trend of governorships across Jakarta. And so that's what we hope to deliver and we hope to incorporate into this next map. Okay, so with evictions being a rather contentious issue in governorships in Jakarta, and so by default politics in Indonesia in general, these are all of the 117 eviction points happening in Jakarta in 2017. 117 eviction points, neighborhoods affecting upwards of 1,100 families. So we're talking about incredible amounts of impact right here. So let's look at how many of these neighborhoods evicted actually lie on waterways, right? So let's input our previous map of Jakarta's waterways scaled. So as we can see, some of the neighborhoods here actually run through waterways and rather major ones as well. So perhaps the argument holds that they're evicted for flooding. But we can see that quite a number actually sort of near the word Jakarta there, you can see right in the middle, the word Jakarta, right around that spot, there's quite a lot of red dots, a lot of evictions that are not near waterways. And so the argument there doesn't hold, right? And so let's perhaps transform the red dots from being eviction points into eviction hotspots, right? Concentrations, areas with not only more evictions in that particular neighborhood, but more sort of evicted neighborhoods within a region. And so this is what our next map here is going to depict, right? We can see that the bigger the red circle, the more evictions happened in that region. And so as we can see again, the region there around the word Jakarta on the map has a lot of evictions, but many of them actually don't lie close to waterways. And so far we can see, and this is justified information from the Jakarta Legal Aid Institute who tracks these data, we can see that some of the evictions, especially in hotspots, concentrations of evictions are not for the basis of flooding, but they are said to be for the basis of flooding. So there's definitely a disconnect here. Okay, now if we input another identified data from Jakarta's disaster mitigation agency here, you can see that the blue dots are actually identified high-risk zones for flooding. We can see then again that many of the big red dots, right? Many of the concentration points for evictions are not only not near waterways, but they are not near, or they're not near identified high risk zones for flooding. And so our review here gets more interesting, right? Now, even if we depict, previously we talked about waterways, so the potential for flooding, as well as identified high risk, so as well the potential for flooding. Now let's talk about actual flooding, right? So the evictions happened in 2017. Now let's go back to 2013, 4 years before the evictions. Let's see actual flooding. So the blue zones you see here now are actual flooded zones in 2013. We can see some of the same Jakarta, hotspots near the word Jakarta right there are still not in flooded zones in 2013. Neither are they in 2014, which is the current map that we're seeing here. 2014, 3 years away from evictions. And so if they were not flooded in 2014, why were they evicted 3 years after that, even if the zones were not affected by flooding, right? Okay, now even if we combine 2013 and 2014 total data for flooded zones, we can still see that quite a number of big red dots for evictions were not affected by flooding. And so the argument that these were made for the purpose of flood mitigation still doesn't hold. Now let's look at a way bigger flood that happened in 2020, right? 3 years after the evictions. So as we can see, 2020 was one of the biggest floods in recent years in Jakarta in January 2020. And again, a lot of the red dot concentrations for evictions right there are not areas affected by the Great Flood, right? And so, there's more questions to be had for sure. But perhaps this map of floods in 2020 are sort of a generalized map. Now let's look at a map that differentiates between the intensity of the flood. So as you can see here, lighter blue portrays perhaps, a water level around your knees, whereas dark blue signifies where the water level has reached our necks and shoulders, right? And so then again, we can see that actually the areas with dark blue aren't areas with a lot of evictions in them, whereas areas with a lot of high concentrations of evictions are actually areas with lighter blue or even white-ish colors for the flooding, right? And so this really signifies and tells us that areas evicted really are not impacted by flooding whatsoever. And so this begs the question once again and again, why do we have this data for concentrations of evictions, right? Why do these happen? Why are they carried out? And if we scale it down from hotspots to individual evictions, we're talking then again about the 117 points of evictions across Jakarta, as well as the upwards of 1,100 families affected in 2017 alone. And so we're talking about big impact and perhaps a seeming disconnect between what types of evictions were carried out and what the rationale given was. Okay, so now let's look at data tracked by the Jakarta Legal Aid Institute once again. As we can see here, this is a data of what the purpose and rationale given for evictions were, the official word that happened throughout 2017. And as we can see, many of them are sort of have quite similar levels, right, of numbers of evictions. But the one with the 80 point right there, 80, penertiban. Penertiban actually means the tidying up of certain zones to comply with existing bylaws, right? Which is a very vague application if we think about it, because there are thousands of bylaws that police and the administration has the sort of freedom to enact or not enact. And so it begs the question, why were they so adamant to actually implement those typical bylaws in those zones? Now, again, if we want to see about the procedures for how the evictions were carried out, they were actually carried out, overwhelming 83% of them were carried out unilaterally without any prior consultation with the residents, which in and of itself is highly problematic. And then as we can see here, the 104 bar right there, it is cases, and be mindful, it's 104 out of 117. An overwhelming majority of those evictions were not given proper solutions by the government. And so Bu Nur Aini's case, while it is definitely an underwhelming solution, was still good because she and her family were given solutions. Many people weren't. And so this is the reason why all three of us, myself with Noval Murtaza and Zahid Azmi Ibrahim, my good colleagues from Pennsylvania State University and Bandung Institute of Technology, respectively, we came together and founded this project called Reconcept, which hopefully everyone's pretty excited about and would sort of want to collaborate with us on this, both in Canada and in Indonesia as well, sort of as a bridging of community of practices. And so the idea behind Reconcept is we're going to be mapping a lot of these issues that we previously did throughout this slide deck, and hopefully be able to provide the general public with a more informed understanding of exactly whether or not the justification for evictions given is flooding, whether or not that actually holds, right? Because most of the population currently actually believe that sort of flooding is a huge issue, which it is, and that the solution is evictions, right? That point, that sort of line between the dots is drawn almost instantly. And so that is what we must actually sort of delve deeper into. And so with that in mind, we're actually going to be releasing our first publication, which is a map-based policy brief. And this is going to lay out in greater detail and greater solutions, recommendations perhaps, what we have been discussing throughout this presentation. It's actually going to go live July 15th, 2021. So 2 weeks from right now from the symposium presentation, and we're going to have it live on our website, which is reconcept.org. Once again, it's going to be on reconcept.org. And with that, I look forward to taking your questions. If you have any at the end of our session today and the Q&A live, and thank you so much.